Robert Frost's poem, Nothing Gold Can Stay, serves as a poignant introduction to this concluding episode on Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. In it, Frost beautifully captures the fleeting nature of beauty and the inevitability of change, reflecting the essence of Cleopatra's story, a tale of grandeur and eventual decline. As he writes that nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaves of flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. Cleopatra emerged as the most powerful figure to sit on the throne of Egypt in centuries. Her gender only serves to underscore the remarkable exceptionality of her reign. She deftly played her hand with Julius Caesar, her ace in the hole, only to have political assassins unexpectedly force her into folding her winning hand. Incredibly, she managed to recover after a few stumbles, attaching herself to Mark Antony, one of the 3 members of Rome's second triumvirate. Although the relationship was mutually beneficial and desired by both of them, she quickly gained the upper hand to the point that England's most famous bard's interpretation of him as a whipped Ken doll remains to this very day. In 40 BCE, the queen gave birth to Antony's twins, setting the stage for the most significant gambit of her life. Her father had painfully endured the whims of Rome while ruling Egypt as a client state beneath the imperial power. Like her father before her, Cleopatra discovered that Rome's demands were more stifling than she had anticipated. Egyptian gold and grain sustained Rome's armies. But with no visible threats on the horizon, Cleopatra saw no reason to continue paying tribute to a distant empire that was led by a mere boy. Plus, she was confident that she could call upon Antony's forces if her own proved to be inadequate. One portrayal of the events to come suggests that Cleopatra could have been content living out the rest of her days as the wealthiest and most powerful woman in the world. But that wasn't her destiny, as another strand of historians believe that Octavian, despite his glistening reputation, would have been unlikely to tolerate Cleopatra and her son, Caesar's own flesh and blood, without interference. As Frost noted, nothing gold can stay forever, and the coming clash of civilizations would forever alter the course of world history. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the rise and fall of Egyptian ruler Cleopatra. Episode number 6, The Queen's Gambit. Historian Stacy Schiff paints a vivid picture of Cleopatra's life over the next 4 years, likening it to a Greek drama where the violence unfolded behind the scenes. Historian Robert Holmes peels back the shroud for us that surrounded this time period by introducing us to the Parthians, a lesser-known group. He writes that the Parthians reestablished Iranian rule over Persia, destroying the Seleucid Empire, challenging Rome, and controlling much of the Silk Road. 200 years into their empire, they had made the mistake of supplying troops to Pompey, rather than Caesar, while humiliating the armies of Mark Antony. Although these events transpired before his ascent to the highest echelons of power within the Roman Empire, it was his lingering desire for vengeance that drove him to seek leverage through Cleopatra's wealth. As our 4th episode illustrated, the queen demonstrated a mastery of the game beyond his reach. Despite their significant influence in halting Rome's eastward expansion, the Parthians remained shrouded in mystery, due to the scarcity of surviving source material, which predominantly originates from their adversaries. It might come as a surprise to many that Rome could be halted at this juncture. However, the glimmer of gold adorning the empire had already begun to tarnish within the first year of Octavian's reign. He was an untested, unknown boy who had seemingly been brought in out of nowhere to govern one of the largest kingdoms in the world. In 38 BCE, an angry mob drew the young man's blood after throwing paving stones as an expression of their displeasure with his rule. Although Antony saved him in that instance, the elder statesman was content to let the boy fail, confident that he would be welcomed back as Rome's savior if he just stayed away long enough for people to forget his flaws. Antony's current wife, Octavian's sister, bore him 2 daughters, both of whom they named Antonia. In 37, she brokered a truce between her husband and brother, which would see Antony hold the final say in the eastern portion of the empire, while Octavian would rule the western half. The agreement averted a civil war and allowed Antony to concentrate upon the Parthians, a threat to both Rome and its client state of Egypt. Schiff believes that something gave way in the last month of 37. Perhaps Antony realized that his wife and brother-in-law were holding him in check, that he was being played for the fool, that collaboration seemed less and less possible. Certainly, the obvious way to secure the upper hand at home was with a blazing military victory abroad. To crush the Parthians was to eliminate Octavian, a strange sort of asymmetrical accounting. He bid farewell to his wife and 2 daughters before setting sail for Syria. Upon his arrival, his first act was to summon his lover Cleopatra to Antioch. Within a few months of her arrival, coins were minted showing them as joint rulers, as though they were already man and wife. It proved to be the first shot fired in their war against Octavian. Evidence suggests that Cleopatra's presence there was for pleasure, rather than official business. Schiff tells us that she left Alexandria secure in the knowledge that no Roman could succeed against Parthia, a rich, immense, and well-defended empire, without her financial support. She knew that the balance of power had subtly shifted. For all of Antony's bravado, despite his superb army, she was very much in possession of the upper hand. Still, she hadn't laid eyes upon the father of her children in 3.5 long years. Unlike today, where news travels instantaneously, the queen of a Roman client state would have received word of Mark Antony fathering 2 daughters with his patrician wife through slower channels of communication. Incredibly, it appears that Antony had zero knowledge of the children he had fathered with her. It would have been easy for Cleopatra to have felt scorned at being pushed aside. She could have abandoned him or double-crossed him. Instead, she rode to him with enthusiasm and was elated when they fell back into their comforting back and forth. She didn't come alone, bringing her twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The 2 3-year-olds met their father for the first time, and he took the unprecedented step of acknowledging them as his own, a gesture that even Caesar had refused to make for Sarion. The experience seemed to liberate Antony, infusing him with newfound vigor as he eagerly threw himself into the campaign. He embarked on the ambitious task of redrawing the borders of the Middle East, determined to reestablish Roman dominance in the region. This included divvying up a sizable portion of the Mediterranean coast to greatly expand Cleopatra's territory. Schiff informs us that as of 37 BCE, Cleopatra ruled over nearly the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, from what is today eastern Libya in northern Africa through Israel, Lebanon, and Syria to southern Turkey, excepting only slivers of Judea. She had nearly reconnected the entire Ptolemaic Empire as it had been upon the death of Alexander the Great. At 32 years old and in the 16th year of her reign, Cleopatra was keenly aware of the significance of her accomplishment. She boldly reordered the Egyptian calendar, designating this milestone as the beginning of a new era, year 1 of her reign. It is also believed that the two lovers tied the knot during the campaign. Antony's decision to do so without informing his wife Octavia is widely regarded as one of his gravest errors. Antony did not capitulate entirely to the Egyptian queen's desires, as he refused to grant her a portion of Judea despite her insistence. By the time the two had reached the border of the Parthian Empire, she was once again pregnant and departed for the home of her birth. The fact that she had gone hundreds of miles out of her way again suggests that she was truly smitten with her Roman general. On her way home, she swung by the kingdom of Judea to check in on King Harold, a key figure in the events of the New Testament. Even then, he wasn't a popular figure, having earned his throne through allegiance to Rome while violently quelling internal conflicts within his own people. The two regents spent a lot of time together, hammering out details regarding trade between the lush, fertile land of Egypt and the desert that was Judea. She exerted considerable pressure on him and emerged victorious in most of their negotiations, leaving Herod relieved that she hadn't demanded even more concessions. The time spent behind closed doors allowed him to later claim that she lustfully came on to him, despite the fact that there is little to no evidence that Herod was anything near her type. At one point, the treacherous king, known for his biblical decree to slaughter children born around the expected arrival of Jesus, attempted to persuade his advisors to carry out the assassination of Cleopatra in her bedchambers. Following through with such a plan would undoubtedly have incurred the wrath of Antony upon the feeble monarch, and thus never happened. Upon reaching the Nile Delta, Cleopatra successfully managed the birth of Ptolemy Philadelphus. Unfortunately, things hadn't gone as smoothly for the boy's father. Schiff tells us that there had been no dazzling success in Parthia, only a demoralizing campaign followed by a disastrous retreat. From the start, Antony had made strategic mistakes. Given the size of his army and the length of the march, he had left his siege equipment behind. He could not always find the Parthians, but they could always find him. Swarms of talented archers and pikemen repeatedly ambushed the regular Roman rows. Antony had relied on the Armenians, Parthia's western neighbor, for military aid. They were not the faithful allies he anticipated. Not for the first time, they lured the Romans into a yawning and abysmal desert, only to abandon them. No battle had been as costly as the retreat. Having marched for 30 miles in darkness, Antony's exhausted men threw themselves upon brackish water. Starving, they feasted on poisonous plants that made them stagger and vomit. Convulsions, dysentery, and delusions followed. What stagnant water and poisonous plants failed to claim, the heat in Armenia and the unending snows of Cappadocia did. Ice congealed on Roman beards, toes and fingers froze. The Parthian campaign significantly tarnished the reputation of Mark Antony, who had sought to demonstrate his Midas touch, but overlooked the repercussions that accompanied the ability to generate gold at will. The disastrous outcome of the campaign drove Antony to contemplate suicide, indicating a state of despair that transcended any influence from Cleopatra's manipulations. Meeting his Egyptian wife in Alexandria served as a catalyst for Antony's return to reason. Like a resilient Ken doll, he swiftly regained his composure, convincing himself, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that he had emerged victorious in the campaign. Cleopatra, however, wasn't the only woman that rushed to his aid, as Octavia secured 2,000 of Rome's elite soldiers to reinforce his precarious position. But Antony urged her to go no farther than Athens, while signaling his intention to rejoin her there. At this, Cleopatra exploded, exclaiming that she had done everything for Antony while accepting the fact that she, the noble queen of Egypt, was being referred to as a mistress by the wider empire. She yelled. She gave him the silent treatment. She may have even threatened to kill herself if Antony left her for Octavia. Ultimately, her histrionics worked, and Antony chose her. Schiff informs us that with Antony's affections went the throne of Egypt. To lose him to Octavia was to lose everything. Hers was a virtuoso performance that yielded enduring results. From this point on, the two were inseparable, for which Dio credits the passion and witchery of Cleopatra, and Plutarch certain drugs or magic rites. Antony's men and Octavia instead acknowledge a very real affection between the two. Geography suggests as much as well. Antony remained with Cleopatra in Alexandria for the winter. He had a sliver of a practical reason to do so, as he intended to march east again come spring. As of the winter of 35, it is impossible to deny a full-blooded romance. If by romance we mean a congenial, intimate past, a shared family, a shared bed, and a shared vision for the future. But nothing gold can stay forever. Mark Antony next proceeded to conquer Armenia. The official reason was the royal family's rejection of a marriage alliance that would have seen his son, Alexander Helios, placed upon the throne. Many historians, however, believe that the campaign was merely a ploy by Cleopatra to ensure that her husband didn't depart for Rome. Antony had embraced the lifestyle of Alexandria, indulging in a life of extravagance and excess. As evidence of his opulence, Antony returned with the Armenian royal family, literally bound in chains made of gold. Their romance reached new heights as Cleopatra and Antony were celebrated as embodiments of Dionysus and the revered Isis, solidifying their mythical status. There is no doubt that within the confines of her capital, Cleopatra was the alpha within the relationship. Antony presented his prisoners to her and addressed her henceforth as the Queen of Kings, a play off of Alexander the Great's infamous title. Her children were counted among the kings that she governed, as Mark Antony wielded his authority as the supreme ruler of Eastern Rome to bestow the donations of Alexandria upon Cleopatra and her offspring. Caesarion was named joint ruler with Cleopatra over Egypt, Cyprus, Syria, and Libya. 2-year-old Ptolemy Philadelphus received lordship over Phoenicia, Syria, and a portion of what eventually became Iraq. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrene, a Greek settlement in eastern Libya, while her twin Alexander Helios would rule over Armenia, Media, and Parthia. Schiff tells us that the donations of Alexandria were an exercise in wishful thinking. For instance, the Armenian king was still very much alive. Parthia was not yet Antony's to distribute, and a 2-year-old was in no position to rule. But the act was a strong message sent to Antony's rival in Rome, Octavian. Historian Chad Scott Brown tells us that such a message was necessary, as Octavian had secured his rule in the West after having finally defeated the pirate Sextus Pompey and relieving Lepidus of his status as a triumvirate member. He writes that with the donations, Antony was trying to establish and legitimize his rule, as well as Cleopatra's, over the Eastern world. Historian Kyle Erickson sees the act as Antony's attempt to solve the issue of succession in the East by creating a stable power base tied to his new Eastern family. In effect, solving Alexander's greatest failure and keeping nearly the entirety of his kingdom intact. His acceptance of his place within the Ptolemaic Empire, as well as the gods which he chose to associate himself with, suggests that he had begun to believe that he was a new Alexander. That was an obsession for a number of Romans, including Caesar and later Caligula, who would remove the great's armor from a museum just so he could lounge around in it. Erickson explains the Romans' thinking for us, detailing that by supposedly giving away the territory, Antony reinforces his own position while simultaneously creating a network of client kingdoms beholden to Rome and to himself. By his marriage to Cleopatra, the adoption of Caesarion, as well as the production of his own children, Antony integrated himself into the long-standing Hellenistic practice of dynastic intermarriage, which had been a key mechanism of control for many of these same regions. For Hussar, this integration was part of a fundamental understanding of a way in which to govern the expanded Roman world. Yet behind it lay the broader vision of the Roman Empire, which Julius Caesar had realized. The empire, to incorporate the whole Mediterranean, must equalize its peoples, must fuse the Hellenistic with the Latin and Gaelic worlds. The intense Roman nationalism and sense of superiority over conquered lands must give way to a cultural integration. Antony seems not to have worked through all the implications of this conviction, but he was spontaneously living in such a position. The nuances of the situation were lost on the Romans, who perceived Antony's actions merely as a fellow Roman dismantling their kingdom and transferring its power to a foreigner and her children. Octavian immediately seized upon the declaration of the donations of Alexandria to begin a vicious propaganda campaign against his co-consul. He exploited the virtue of his sister to tarnish Antony's reputation, accusing him of neglecting his familiar responsibilities by openly conducting an affair without attending to his wife or their children. Octavian also openly questioned why Cleopatra was portraying herself as an Egyptian goddess rather than one from the Roman pantheon. Teacher Jesse Cifuentes tells us that by contrast, Octavian modeled himself as the quintessential Roman, who was declared victorious commander, brought peace to Rome, did not have an Egyptian mistress, and was working for the betterment of Rome. What really riled up the Romans, however, was when it was revealed that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria. Such revelations came to light after Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from a Roman temple and publicly read it aloud to the assembled masses. Although the actual document didn't suggest anything of the sort, Octavian alleged that his burial request was a sign that Mark Antony intended to transfer the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria, Egypt. By all accounts, Cleopatra began her 35th year of life content and confident with her rule. Schiff writes that with her hybrid family, she had ingeniously solved the Roman problem. the consort problem, the shrinking empire problem. She no longer needed to be propped up by foreign troops, nor could any Alexandrian critic conceivably object to her friendship with a Roman. She had tamed that power. With the donations, she experienced a surge of popularity. Her shipyards were busy as she doubled the size of Antony's navy. The revenues flowed in from Damascus and Beirut in the east to Tripoli in the west. Cities minted coins in her honor. She had made good on a 3rd century poet's promise by which a Ptolemy, simultaneously safeguarding and supplementing his inheritance, outweighs all other monarchs in wealth. Antony, on the other hand, took over running the Gymnasium of Alexandria, fusing Roman and Egyptian cultures. History books suggest that the war with Octavian began immediately after the Roman was notified of the donations of Alexandria, that they were the opening salvo of the war with Cleopatra, manipulating Antony in order to steal Rome right out from beneath the feet of its rightful ruler in order to give it to her bastard son, who may or may not have been the blood of Julius Caesar. But that's just the story that Octavian wants you to believe. The Roman emperor did such a good job separating Antony from his homeland that few Romans believed that what came next counted as a civil war. As part of the subterfuge, Octavian ensured that the Senate declared war on Cleopatra rather than his co-ruler. The two surviving members of the Second Triumvirate began hurling accusations at each other from opposite sides of the Mediterranean. Their long-standing discord quickly erupted into a full-blown confrontation as they unleashed a torrent of accusations and grievances. The infighting was vicious and personal, with Antony accusing Octavian of cowardice, only to be hit back with the claim that Antony was an alcoholic. Schiff tells us that between them, Antony and Octavian covered the usual schoolyard litany, that the other was effeminate, practiced sodomy, was a coward, and that in comparison to the other was unrefined, or that they were guilty of overly refined practices of personal hygiene. Octavian was a veritable weakling. Antony had passed his prime. He could no longer win any contests save those in exotic dancing or the erotic arts. Antony sneered that Octavian had slept with his illustrious granduncle. How else to account for his unexpected adoption? This isn't to say that Mark Antony was a saint. Indeed, his flaws were apparent. He indulged excessively in alcohol, had abandoned his wife and 2 daughters without a word of explanation, and his vanity led to dire consequences, costing people their lives. Octavian, on the other hand, appears to escape scrutiny for his own transgressions. Among them was his practice of seducing other men's wives under the guise of scientific inquiry, extracting their secrets to later use against their husbands. Historian Vedran Bilata writes that Octavian's path to power was filled with bloodshed. It was a mixture of naked ambition, political intrigue, and war. Octavian didn't hesitate to exile family members who defied him, even going so far as to banish his own daughter. Additionally, a troubling number of his heirs met untimely deaths under suspicious circumstances. Despite his flaws, Octavian Augustus's legacy endures, immortalized in the naming of the month of August after him. In contrast, Cleopatra's name was systematically tarnished and vilified, serving as a cautionary tale to dissuade women from seeking positions of power. With the writing on the wall for all to see, Antony and Cleopatra began to reinforce their coastal holdings for a future assault on Rome. Cleopatra paid for the buildup, furnishing 200 of Antony's 500 warships and enough grain to feed their 112,000-man military forces for the duration of the coming conflict. The year 33 BCE witnessed a dramatic scene in the Senate, as senators initially sided with Antony, only to disperse in panic when Octavian entered with armed escorts, plunging Rome into disarray. Nearly 400 senators fled to Egypt, splitting the Roman government in two. Antony wanted to leave Cleopatra safely behind in Alexandria, but she insisted. The Roman statesman found himself unable to refuse her request, given that her troops constituted the largest portion of the army, all of which she had fully financed. Her ability to speak 9 languages meant that only she was capable of communicating with the assembled coalition of monarchs from their client states. In April of 32 BCE, they embarked on their journey to Turkey to assemble their forces, subsequently landing in Athens in May. At this critical moment, the 37-year-old queen exhibited a lack of restraint, sullying the reputation of Octavia, Antony's estranged wife. She showered the city of Athens with lavish gifts in an effort to assert her superiority as a woman. Her presence distracted Antony, as he attended principally to her rather than the looming war. Shift recounts a childish incident where the two behaved more like newlyweds than parents. She writes that at one juncture Cleopatra happened to ride conspicuously past the courts on the shoulders of her servants as Antony was presiding over a legal case. A distinguished Roman orator held the floor, or did until Antony caught sight of Cleopatra. He then sprang up from his tribunal, forsaking the trial, and hanging on to Cleopatra's litter, escorted her on her way to their bedchambers. The tensions of what had thus far only been a Cold War escalated after Antony officially divorced Octavian's sister, insisting that she vacate their shared residence. Such behavior was deemed unbecoming, and shortly thereafter a key advisor to Antony defected to Octavian's side, bringing with him crucial intelligence regarding the size and capability of Antony's forces. It was upon his defection that Octavian had risked the god's wrath by unlawfully entering a temple to procure his rival's will, which stated that he wished to be buried in Alexandria. As shocking as the discovery and the procurement of the will was, it is equally notable that no one besides Octavian himself actually saw the document, leading some historians to speculate that it had been fabricated for the purpose of inciting the war. Upon publication of the damning revelations, every chronicler in Rome turned on Antony and Cleopatra, writing copious amounts of pamphlets that detailed how she had bewitched him so that he was no longer the master of himself. By their accounts, Cleopatra had already conquered Antony and now had her eyes set upon Rome itself. By October, there was enough popular support that Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. It was a dramatic start, with Shift writing that in a military cloak he personally launched a spear drenched in pig blood towards the east from a ritual patch of hostile soil in Rome. There is speculation that he invented this ancient rite for the occasion, that Octavian was making up the history as he went along. He was very good at restoring traditions, including those that never existed. The war would be against Cleopatra, as Antony was deprived of his consulship and relieved of all authority vested in him by the Roman Senate. Even worse for the veteran statesman, the Senate outlawed him, an extreme measure akin to stripping one of their identity, leaving Antony with no recourse. At the onset of war, the Egyptians appeared to be in a more advantageous position. Cleopatra's resources enabled a robust defense along the coast, while Octavian's decision to raise taxes to fund his side of the conflict sparked riots within the capital. It is perhaps because of this, and not because he had lost his lust for battle in his old age, that caused Mark Antony to hesitate. Schiff tells us that it was difficult to escape the impression that Antony, the most famous soldier alive, had no desire for an epic battle. Octavian invited Antony to an absurd staged encounter. Antony challenged Octavian to a duel. Neither materialized. Mostly, the two sides confined themselves to insults and idle threats. 1 year into the spectacle, Octavian's lead general, Agrippa, made a surprise crossing to Greece, disrupting his opponent's supply lines. The move forced Antony north. Weeks of skirmishes ensued, but Octavian couldn't lure Antony out to sea, and Antony couldn't coax Octavian out on land. The hesitancy cost them morale, as Cleopatra was urging action while Antony steadfastly denied her. Although he never wavered in his faith to her, other members of the coalition, influenced by bigoted views about a woman's role, gradually turned against Cleopatra, accusing her of meddling where she didn't belong. Whereas in other instances, Cleopatra had been the belle of the ball, she now appears in the historical record as an infuriating and exhausting presence. Octavian persisted in tightening the naval blockade around their position. Soon, malaria took hold, and deprived of access to the sea, Antony was forced to rely on the populations of entire towns to transport their army's supplies along land routes. Plutarch's portrayal of sacks of wheat on their shoulders, whips at their backs, offers a powerful glimpse into the trials faced during this period. Schiff tells us that what the blockade, the disease, the debilitating inactivity, the heat did not affect, the desertions did. Slaves and client kings alike abandoned the cause. Antony made an example of two near deserters, a senator and a Syrian king, tortured and executed to discourage imitators. Antony was himself rattled, enough so to attempt a solitary stroll along the fortifications towards the sea, in the course of which Octavian's men nearly succeeded in kidnapping him. The defections affected him greatly. He was afterwards fiercely paranoid. By one account, he distrusted even Cleopatra, whom he suspected of attempting to poison him. To prove her innocence, she was said to have prepared a lethal drink, only to intercept the goblet as Antony raised it to his lips. Had she intended to kill him, she would not have done so, would she? She then sent for a prisoner, to whom she handed the potion. It had the advertised effect. Another man, claiming that Cleopatra sought to poison him, absconded with Antony's battle plans and defected to Octavian's side successfully. The blockade endured for 16 weeks, with winter finally descending upon the Mediterranean. As their foothold steadily crumbled, Antony and Cleopatra made the joint decision to confront Octavian at sea, a rare moment of unified resolve between them. What was meant to be the initial skirmish of a protracted campaign unexpectedly evolved into the entirety of the war, as the Battle of Actium determined the conflict's outcome. The impact of the blockade became evident as Antony initiated his long-awaited maneuver, resorting to burning 80 ships due to the lack of crew to sail them. Although they had originally arrived in Greece with more ships, he would enter the Battle of Actium significantly outnumbered 230 to 400. Their next action involved loading all of Cleopatra's wealth onto their flagship, the Antonia. Although she was aboard, there was no intention for her to take part in the battle. Naval engagements during this time were a curious sight to witness. More often than not, the two opposing ships would maneuver close to each other, then turn, with the men aboard attempting to eliminate their adversaries using bows, spears, and small ballistae. Since few individuals could swim, ships often refrained from ramming one another unless it was perceived that they were already in the process of sinking. Wars and technological advancements are closely intertwined. Inventions often take significant leaps forward during times of conflict, providing opportunities for their practical demonstration and showcasing their importance. In this particular scenario, Antony possessed the larger ships, formidable and lethal, albeit considerably slower in comparison. Historian Cassius Dio referred to them as walled towns or islands, many in number and close together, being besieged by the sea. What's more, Octavian was in possession of Antony's war plans, and thus could utilize his smaller ship's agility to confound his opponent. Boletta informs us that Octavian's fleet had also deployed the Harpax, a large ship-mounted ballista that could launch multi-pronged grappling hooks at enemy vessels, winching them alongside for boarding. Schiff writes that it was from Cleopatra's perspective an odd floating land battle, with Octavian's men playing the cavalry and Antony's men repelling the assault from their floating fortresses, the largest of which loomed 10 feet above the waterline. The fierce ramming and grappling continued inconclusively until late in the afternoon. At about 3 o'clock, Octavian's left wing shifted to outflank Antony's. Antony's, in turn, edged north. The center of the line dissolved. Without warning, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly hoisted sail and, expertly plying the wind, broke coolly through the middle of the battle, past the flying slings and missiles, beyond the spears and axes of the enemy line, sowing confusion on all sides. Octavian's men looked on in amazement as Cleopatra sped south in her majestic flagship, its purple sails billowing. Their shock only increased when moments later Antony transferred from his flagship to a swift galleon followed behind, with 40 ships of his personal squadron. Most historians believe that the flight had been pre-arranged and carefully orchestrated. The battle plans that had been stolen had indeed outlined the option. The Battle of Actium was initially intended to break the naval siege, rather than mark the beginning of Octavian's downfall. However, once the Romans seized control of the narrative, their propagandists ensured that the retreat was portrayed as a cowardly act, accusing Antony and Cleopatra of sacrificing their men, a deed unbefitting of true Romans. It is conceivable, however, that Roman propaganda was accurate, portraying Cleopatra's retreat as the action of an inexperienced woman unaccustomed to battle, succumbing to panic and fleeing the scene. This interpretation would also support the criticism of Antony as being under Cleopatra's control, depicted as a mere pawn manipulated by the queen. According to this narrative, upon witnessing his wife's flight, Antony abandoned his own men, displaying an act of unparalleled cowardice. The first piece of evidence supporting such a claim comes from Boletta, who notes that one would expect that remainders of Antony's fleet, losing their commander, would put down weapons and surrender. That was not the case. While part of the fleet surrendered the next morning, some of the crew continued to offer resistance, going down with their ships. Most of the surviving ships were so badly damaged that they could not move, so they were burned on the spot. Surely a pre-arranged retreat would have been explained to the soldiers ahead of time. The second piece of evidence comes from Shift, who notes that when Antony finally caught up to Cleopatra, the reunion was not a happy one. Antony neither saw nor spoke to Cleopatra on account of what sounds more like shame than anger. Something had gone very wrong. The historian speculates that the two may have planned the maneuver only in case of necessity, and alone or together acted decisively. Or Cleopatra may have made her exit prematurely. Regardless, Actium marked the onset of their downfall, sealing the fate of both Antony and Cleopatra. He broke first, with Shift describing the 52-year-old soldier as having his head bowed, staring listlessly out to sea. The hero of Philippi, the new Dionysus, reduced to a great brooding hulk, his powerful arms and shoulders still for all to see. His internal uncertainties were exacerbated by the prevailing culture among Roman commanders, which dictated that they should confront defeat head-on, persevering against all adversity. In the event of failure, Roman commanders were traditionally expected to take their own lives. However, in this case, Antony had fled after his wife, abandoning soldiers who had remained loyal to him for decades. He reluctantly persuaded himself to continue the fight, parting ways with Cleopatra to rendezvous with the 4 legions he had stationed in Libya. Meanwhile, Cleopatra made her way back to Alexandria. Drawing from past experiences, the queen proclaimed to her people that Actium had resulted in a great victory. At the start of her reign, Pompey had met a grim fate at the hands of the mob for speaking the truth. However, the news couldn't remain concealed for long, as Octavian's triumph had effectively removed 19 legions and 12,000 cavalry from the playing field. One aspect on which all agree is that Cleopatra was a survivor, ready to do whatever it took to endure. As the Alexandrian elite began to figure out the truth, the queen went on a murderous rampage to ensure that no one remained capable of challenging her rule. She was compelled to act swiftly, which may have made her actions appear somewhat haphazard. She seized private fortunes, dispatched the severed head of the Armenian king to his rival in a bid to garner his support, and commenced a search for a new land where she could begin anew. For this final endeavor, she employed manual labor to haul her remaining ships over the narrow isthmus of land, which has since been eradicated, in order to transfer her fleet from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Regrettably, the haste with which she operated came back to haunt her, as locals along the Red Sea corridor set fire to the ships as soon as they had completed the extraordinarily formidable transition. Her last hope rested with Judea's King Herod, who had been fortunate to have been relieved from supporting her during the Battle of Actium due to Cleopatra's lack of trust in him. Should he accept her forces, the unforgiving desert would sap Octavian's strength, rendering him susceptible to a fierce counterattack by their united forces. Unfortunately, Cleopatra's instincts about Herod had been spot on, and the man quickly shifted his allegiance to Octavian, setting the stage for Roman rule in the Holy Land just in time to witness the comparatively short life of Jesus of Nazarene. Antony's survival efforts weren't quite as grand, with Shift proclaiming that after Actium, he roamed restlessly about North Africa, mostly with 2 friends, a philosopher and an especially clever, steadfast soldier. The relative solitude comforted him. But in Cyrene, he discovered that his 4 legions had defected. Crushed, he attempted suicide. This was the second known attempt at ending his own life. However, his 2 friends intervened, successfully escorting him to Alexandria, where he remained ensnared in his depression, retreating into the realm of alcohol. Shift reveals that he ordered a long causeway built into the Alexandrian harbor, at the end of which he fixed a modest hut near the foot of the lighthouse. He declared himself an exile, a latter-day Timon of Athens, for he himself also had been wronged and treated with ingratitude by his friends, and therefore hated and distrusted all mankind. Cleopatra attempted to get him to snap out of it, but her efforts just sent him into a melancholy frenzy of partying, ordering lavish feasts throughout the city in an attempt to enjoy what he believed to be his last days on earth. Cleopatra worked overtime to frame these celebrations as heralding the era of Caesarion's reign as pharaoh. The boy was 16 years old, and though Cleopatra expected to pay a heavy price for her role in the failed insurrection, she hoped that the Ptolemaic dynasty would continue. She sent messengers to Octavian in an effort to bargain for her kids' lives and subsequent places within the imperium. When her words didn't work, she sent a golden scepter, crown, and throne. The Roman kept the gifts, suggesting privately to her that an agreement could be worked out if she were to arrange for Antony's execution. Unbeknownst to his wife, Antony had privately signaled to Octavian that he would kill himself if he was given assurances that Cleopatra would live. As the 2 sides inched closer to a deal, Octavian sent in his diplomatic closer, a handsome man of great renown. The diplomat's private meetings with the queen stoked Antony's jealousy, resulting in an explosive outburst that resulted in a humiliating public whipping for Octavian's ambassador. Confident in his narrative and superior numbers, Octavian patiently awaited warmer sailing weather, all the while banking on the possibility that Cleopatra would somehow resolve the issue of his troublesome brother-in-law on his behalf. When the Roman finally did strike, his forces approached Egypt from both Syria and Libya. Octavian was with the troops in North Africa and passed through the Sahara without a single battle. This detail leads many historians to believe that Cleopatra was under the impression that she had reached a deal with the Roman, unaware that all of Octavian's assurances were made in private. In public, he continued to disparage Cleopatra to anyone who would listen. In light of the unfolding circumstances, Cleopatra and Antony formed a group known as the Companions to the Death, consisting of steadfast individuals pledged to remain by their side until the bitter end. However, there are hints that the queen hadn't completely abandoned her resolve. Shift tells us that she may well have been double-dealing, bowing to the inevitable, bargaining for leniency. She had been ruthlessly pragmatic before. At this point, her interests substantially diverged from Antony's. He could hope for little more than a brilliant last stand. She fought to preserve a dynasty. Cleopatra knew that she could not hold out militarily against Octavian. Certainly there was acquiescence, if not treachery. As she had discouraged the partitions of Upper Egypt from rising up in her defense, she claimed she did not care to see them needlessly massacred. She may have been banking still on negotiation. Dio assigns her a second, infinitely less plausible motive as well. He asserts that she believed the Roman's diplomat when he had revealed that Octavian was smitten with her. why should Octavian be any different from Caesar and Antony? But just because Schiff believes that the rumors of Cleopatra's seduction of Octavian is false doesn't mean that everyone shares her opinion. For contemporary chroniclers and subsequent historians, it seemed entirely plausible that the Egyptian seductress would endeavor to ensnare her third Roman leader. One obstacle remained: the continued existence of her husband, Mark Antony. Despite appearing just days before as though the aging warrior would drink himself to death, Cleopatra's husband rallied all of his former glory and rode out at the head of a cavalry charge, routing Octavian's forces approaching from the west. Rather than a victory, however, it merely slowed down the significantly larger Roman forces. Upon his return to Alexandria, he passionately kissed Cleopatra in front of the court, a spark of life rekindling in his eyes. By the time Octavian was camped outside the walls of Alexandria, however, his melancholy had returned in full force. He urged his friends and servants to drink everything that they could get their hands on, since there would be no more opportunities in the future. Upon rising to observe the battle the next morning, he was stunned to discover that his cavalry and navy had defected to the enemy's side in a premeditated move. He flew towards the palace in a rage, but unbeknownst to him, Cleopatra had barricaded herself within her family's mausoleum, along with all of the wealth that she could get her hands on. If Octavian wouldn't let her leave, she intended to bury her fortune with her. Before executing her plan, however, she cleverly arranged for a note to find its way into the hands of Antony. The essence of this love note was to deceitfully convey to him that she had taken her own life and to encourage him to follow suit. As we've discussed previously, Antony had teetered on the brink of suicide on numerous occasions before. Furthermore, we've explored how in the ancient world suicide was regarded with honor, particularly among the upper echelons of Roman society. Historian Sarah Bond spills the tea for us, revealing that upon receiving the news of his wife's death, Dio remarks that Antony immediately wished for his own death. He first asked one of the bystanders to slay him, but when the man drew his sword and slew himself instead, Antony wished to imitate his courage and so gave himself a wound and fell upon his face, causing the bystanders to believe that he was dead. Plutarch instead notes that he rammed the sword into his stomach, but still did not immediately die of his wound. Plutarch's account is the most drama-filled, with Antony reportedly crying out, "O Cleopatra, I am not distressed to have lost you, for I shall straightway join you. But I am grieved that a commander as great as I should be found to be inferior to a woman in courage." Just because his blow didn't immediately end his life, didn't mean that it wasn't vicious. The sword that he likely used would have been 2.5 feet long, with an extended steel point. Missing his heart by inches, he punctured his abdomen and dropped unconsciously to the couch. Schiff remarks humorously that it was somehow typical of Antony to leave the job half done. The sources aren't clear, but somehow servants managed to reunite the two lovers within the mausoleum, ensuring that his final gaze fell upon a woman who had deceived him by manipulating his love for her, ultimately leading him to take his own life. Regret immediately overwhelmed the queen, with Schiff noting that Cleopatra began to rip and tear at her robes. It is one of only 2 recorded moments in which she loses her colossal self-possession. She yields to raw emotion. The two had been together for the better part of a decade. Cleopatra wiped the blood from his body and smeared it across her face. She beat and scratched at her breasts. She called Antony master, commander, and husband, as he died in her arms. Octavian's negotiators promptly reached the mausoleum. The war had incurred an immense debt, and returning to Rome without Alexandria's treasury would render it impossible for him to ascend to the imperial throne. The Roman ruler made her promises. She sought guarantees, begging him to allow her children to inherit her kingdom. As the talks went on, some of Octavian's agents found the back entrance that had been used to ferry Antony's body into the mausoleum. With the queen distracted by the ongoing negotiations, Octavian's agents snuck in and disarmed Cleopatra just as she attempted to take her own life. Her political nemesis ordered her to be watched at all moments, well aware of her lifelong experiments with poison. Her and Antony's children were initially treated well, but Antony's loyal adult son, from the first of his 3 marriages, was hunted down and beheaded. It was anticipated that such a fate would befall Caesarion, the blood heir of Julius Caesar. Accordingly, he had set sail on the Nile weeks before Octavian had arrived at the city gates, laden with treasure destined for India. Initially, Octavian seemed gracious, granting pardon to the city, purportedly in homage to Alexander the Great. He allowed Cleopatra to prepare a proper funeral for Mark Antony and granted her a private audience 7 days into her captivity. We only have Plutarch and Dio's accounts of the conference, but in both narratives, Cleopatra does not claim responsibility for dispatching Antony, casting doubt on whether she had been acting on behalf of the Romans. Plutarch recounts that the queen pleaded for her life, while Dio asserts that she was instead begged for death. She departed the meeting after surrendering an inventory of Egypt's most valuable treasures, cunningly omitting several items to ensure she retained leverage, or at least a source of backup revenue to begin anew. While Octavian publicly uttered all the right words to her, she soon discerned that his plan all along was to showcase her in a triumphal procession through Rome, only to subsequently confine her to the depths of the dungeons. It was a fate that the 39-year-old was unwilling to conceive of. 3 days before Octavian was set to depart Alexandria with Cleopatra and her 3 young children in tow, the queen requested to return to the mausoleum for a bath and a meal of figs. Fully aware of the queen's love of poisons, the guards would have examined the basket's contents carefully, sampling the goods before letting them through. While she privately got ready for the bath, the queen set the seal to a letter that had been prepared in advance and announced that it ought to be delivered to Octavian. Its contents included a request that her body ought to be buried beside Antony's. Immediately understanding, the Roman ruler jumped up and sprinted to the mausoleum. But by the time the guards had opened the door, it was already too late. Cleopatra was found lying on a golden couch, crown atop her head, with the traditional pharaoh's crook and flail beside her. She had chosen to die as an Egyptian queen, rather than a Roman prisoner. The prevailing narrative surrounding her demise suggests that a small poisonous Egyptian snake, commonly known as a black asp, had been concealed within the basket of figs. It's said that the queen held the serpent to her breast, allowing it to deliver the fatal bite. Many contend that this narrative is overly dramatic, potentially influenced by the biblical tale of deceitful women and serpents in the Garden of Eden. Some suggest that only certain dates had been laced with poison, successfully evading the guards who had tested the delivery. while others wonder if she had managed to previously hide a small batch of poison somewhere within the deep recesses of her family's mausoleum. Historian Marilyn Butts believes that Octavian may have allowed the poison to pass his guards. She writes that by all accounts, her continued existence was a dilemma for Octavian. He couldn't parade her in his triumph, as people still remembered her sister Arsinoe IV, and he could not visibly castigate her character further, as it would reflect poorly on the late Caesar. Rome would, in such a case, recall her relationship with his adopted father. Therefore, Octavian could not discernibly have a hand in her death. Her death by asp or cobra is a common theory steeped in symbolism, if not at all provable. This theory, favored by Octavian, allowed him to depict Cleopatra in his triumphal procession, a coup on his part, despite his earlier issues with such a spectacle. With the death of the opposition, Octavian had brilliantly concluded a propaganda campaign that would cement Rome's anti-Cleopatra views. Octavian honored her request, burying her beside her husband. To do otherwise would risk the rising up of Alexandria. To this day, their tomb remains undiscovered. With her death, Egypt was officially folded into the Roman Empire. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were adopted by Antony's second wife, Octavia, to be raised alongside their half-sisters. Caesarion was lured back to Alexandria in a foolhardy attempt to negotiate with Octavian for his mother's freedom. Upon his arrival, he was tortured and killed. Now no one could whisper that there was any other heir to Caesar than Octavian. The man who would claim the name of Augustus was without a doubt a dictator, but he was a clever one. Rather than immediately declaring himself consul without a colleague, he gave his power back to a Senate which had long since forgotten how to use it. That institution played hot potato with the responsibility, immediately giving it back to him. They proclaimed him princeps, or first citizen, disguising his dictatorship and populism. In complete control of the narrative, Octavian ascended to godhood, beginning the Roman Empire in earnest. He obliterated Mark Antony from the historical record, declaring his rival's birthday of January 14th as an unlucky day, and passing legislation that made it illegal to connect the two names of Mark and Antony together. When his history of the Battle of Actium was finally written, neither Antony nor Cleopatra's name merited inclusion. That is a confounding decision, as the Smithsonian Magazine notes that Cleopatra's story differs from most women's stories, in that the men who shaped it enlarged rather than erased her role for their own reasons. Her relationship with Antony was the longest of her life. The two were together for the better part of 11 years, but her relationship with Octavian proved the most enduring. He made much of his defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, delivering to Rome the tabloid version of an Egyptian queen, insatiable, treacherous, bloodthirsty, power-crazed. Octavian magnified Cleopatra to hyperbolic proportions to do the same with his victory, and to smuggle Mark Antony, his real enemy and former brother-in-law, out of the picture. As Antony was erased from the record, Actium was wondrously transformed into a major engagement, a resounding victory, a historical turning point. Octavian had rescued Rome from great peril. He had resolved the civil war. He had restored peace after 100 years of unrest. Time began anew. To read the official historians, it is as if with his return the Italian peninsula burst, after a crippling ashen century of violence, into technicolor, the crops sitting suddenly upright, crisp and plumb in the fields. Validity was restored to the laws, authority to the courts, and dignity to the Senate, proclaims the historian Valatius. The years after Actium were a time of extravagant praise and lavish myth-making. Cleopatra was particularly ill-served. The turncoats wrote the history. Her career coincided as well with a flowering of Latin literature. It was Cleopatra's curse to inspire its great poets, happy to expound on her shame in a language inhospitable to her. Horace celebrated her defeat before it had occurred. She helpfully illuminated one of the poet's Proprietus's favorite points. A man in love is a helpless man, painfully subservient to his mistress. It was as if Octavian had delivered Rome from that ill as well. He restored the natural order of things. Men ruled women, and Rome ruled the world. On both counts, Cleopatra was crucial to the story. She stands among the few losers whom history remembers, if for the wrong reasons. But we, of course, know the truth of the matter. Cleopatra had played the Game of Thrones as well as any man, but ultimately suffered the fate of all those who found themselves on the losing side of the equation. Rather than becoming the successor to Hannibal, her gender weighed her down for centuries, until our society was finally ready to understand how great she was. Despite Octavian's efforts to tarnish her legacy, nothing gold can stay, and her accomplishments endure for us to reassess from today's vantage point. I'll conclude with one final profound insight from Stacy Schiff, whose groundbreaking work reclaiming the Egyptian queen earned her the Pulitzer Prize. She reminds us that Cleopatra remains largely incomparable. She had plenty of predecessors, few successors. With her, the age of empresses essentially came to an end. In 2,000 years, only one or two other women could be said to have wielded unrestricted authority over such a vast realm. Cleopatra remains nearly alone at the all-male table of history. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.